The first man collapsed without warning. One moment he was standing on the steel deck, gripping a railing as the ship cut through heavy seas. The next, his knees buckled, his body slumped forward, and he hit the deck hard enough to crack his helmet against the metal. The men around him froze, unsure whether he had been hit by shrapnel, suffered a stroke, or simply dropped dead. Within minutes, another sailor went down. Then another. On board U.S. Navy ships operating in the Pacific, this scene began repeating itself with alarming frequency. Sailors were collapsing in the middle of routine operations. Some lost consciousness. Others became disoriented, confused, unable to speak or stand. In the worst cases, men stopped breathing altogether. At first, officers blamed exhaustion, then dehydration, then tropical disease, but none of the usual explanations fit. These were healthy men, young men, men who had passed medical inspections only days earlier. And yet they were dropping like flies. Shipboard doctors were baffled. The symptoms came on suddenly and escalated fast. Skin turned pale or bluish, pulse weakened, muscles locked up, consciousness faded in seconds. By the time a stretcher arrived, some sailors were already beyond help. Official Navy medical manuals offered only one response: stabilize, monitor, evacuate to a hospital ship if possible. But out at sea under combat conditions, evacuation wasn't always an option. Sometimes it would take hours, sometimes days. And these men didn't have minutes. In more than one case, a sailor died before the ship's medic could even finish writing the initial report. The situation grew desperate. By mid-war, ship logs began showing an unsettling pattern. Crews operating in certain conditions, long watches, cold night operations, exposure to wind and spray, were suffering sudden collapses at rates that could not be ignored. Destroyers, cruisers, even submarines reported the same phenomenon. Men were freezing from the inside out. Not hypothermia in the traditional sense. The air wasn't cold enough, the water wasn't icy, but the body's core temperature was dropping rapidly anyway, triggered by fatigue, wet clothing, wind chill, and stress. The Navy called it exposure shock, and it was killing sailors silently. Standard medical doctrine said the treatment was gradual warming: remove wet clothing, wrap the patient in blankets, give hot drinks if conscious. Wait. That worked on land. It did not work at sea. On pitching decks in combat zones, with shells falling nearby and engines roaring, gradual often meant too late. Ship doctors watched men slip away while following the rules perfectly. And then, on one battered destroyer in the South Pacific, a single doctor broke them. He did it out of desperation. The sailor in front of him had no pulse strong enough to count. His lips were blue, his hands were stiff, his breathing came in shallow, irregular gasps. By every guideline in the Navy manual, the man was hours away from stabilization, if he survived at all. The doctor didn't have hours. He looked around the cramped sickbay, at the tools meant for treating cuts, burns, and shrapnel wounds. None of them would help. Then his eyes stopped on something no medical officer was ever supposed to use this way. A heat source. Not a blanket. Not a warm drink. A direct, intense heat. The manuals explicitly warned against it. Rapid heat application was considered dangerous. It could cause shock, cardiac arrest, or internal damage. The doctrine was clear: never apply high heat to a hypothermic patient. The doctor ignored it. He ordered the sailor stripped of his wet clothing immediately. Another corpsman hesitated. The doctor snapped at him to move faster. They dragged the man closer to the engine room bulkhead, where residual heat from the ship's machinery radiated through the steel. Still nothing. The sailor's chest barely moved. The doctor made a decision that would later be described as reckless, forbidden, and medically unsound. He ordered the man pressed directly against the heated metal. Not wrapped, not insulated. Direct contact. The corpsman protested. The metal was hot enough to burn. This was against every rule they had been taught. The doctor cut him off. Do it now. They held the sailor there. 10 seconds passed. Nothing. 20 seconds. Then something changed. The sailor's fingers twitched. A weak gasp escaped his mouth. His chest rose more forcefully than before. 30 seconds in, his pulse returned, faint but unmistakable. Everyone in the sickbay froze. The doctor leaned in, counting under his breath. The pulse strengthened. Color slowly returned to the man's face. His breathing steadied. Within a minute, the sailor was conscious. Within 5, he could speak. Within 10, he was sitting up, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the men around him in confusion. He had gone from nearly dead to alive in less time than it took to load a deck gun. No manual explained this. No training covered it. But it worked. The doctor didn't report what he had done. He knew better. Applying intense heat directly to a hypothermic patient violated Navy medical doctrine. If reported, he could face disciplinary action or worse. Instead, he wrote the recovery off as rapid response to environmental exposure. But the sickbay crew knew the truth, and they remembered it. Days later, another sailor collapsed during a night watch. Same symptoms, same rapid decline. This time, the corpsman didn't wait for permission. He dragged the sailor toward the same bulkhead. 30 seconds later, the man was breathing normally. Word spread quietly. Not through official channels. Not through reports. Through whispers. On one ship to another. From medic to medic. From corpsman to corpsman. There's a way to bring them back. Don't follow the book. Heat, real heat, faster. They called it different things. The engine wall. The hot bulkhead. The steel cure. Unofficial. Unapproved. Effective. Soon, Navy doctors across the Pacific were quietly testing the method. Some used engine room walls, others used heated pipes, a few even rigged makeshift metal plates warmed over burners. Every time, the result was the same. Sailors revived in seconds. Men who would have died under standard treatment lived. Crews returned to duty the same day. And the Navy's official medical establishment had no idea it was happening, because no one dared write it down. By late 1944, this forbidden heat trick had saved dozens of lives, possibly hundreds, but it remained invisible, buried beneath sanitized reports and vague terminology. Until one case forced it into the open. A cruiser took heavy damage during a night engagement. Fires burned across the deck. Water flooded compartments. Sailors worked for hours in soaked clothing under freezing wind. When the action ended, bodies began collapsing everywhere. The sickbay was overwhelmed. Blankets ran out. Stretchers ran out. Time ran out. The ship's senior medical officer made the same decision the destroyer doctor had months earlier, but this time on a massive scale. He ordered hypothermic sailors lined up against heated machinery spaces. Dozens of them. Some officers objected. This was madness. This was against regulations. The doctor ignored them. What followed stunned everyone aboard. Men revived in waves, one after another. Sailors who had been unresponsive seconds earlier were suddenly breathing, coughing, moving. Some vomited, some cried, some laughed hysterically, but they lived. The deck that night became something no one had ever seen before. A ship resurrecting its own crew. By morning, the cruiser had lost fewer men to exposure than any comparable engagement. The doctor filed his report carefully. He didn't describe the method directly, but Navy medical intelligence officers noticed something odd. Anomalies. Ships reporting unusually high survival rates. Cases of severe exposure with impossible recovery times. Men revived faster than physiology should allow. Someone started asking questions. And once questions were asked, the truth could no longer stay hidden. As the wounded sailor was carried into the cramped sickbay, the smell of oil, salt, and blood mixed with the metallic tang of fear. The ship was still vibrating from evasive maneuvers. Somewhere above, engines roared. Somewhere below, steel groaned. The battle was not over, but for the men inside sickbay, time had slowed to a crawl. The sailor's skin was pale, his lips were blue, his pulse was faint, irregular, barely there. Shock had already begun its quiet work, draining heat from his body faster than the doctors could measure it. In standard Navy medical training, this was the beginning of the end. Severe hypothermia combined with shock meant minutes, sometimes seconds, before the heart simply stopped responding. The corpsman looked up at the doctor, his voice tight. "He's fading." The doctor did not reach for morphine. He did not reach for plasma. He did not reach for oxygen. Instead, he turned and shouted a command that no Navy medical manual authorized. "Heat now, as hot as you can make it." The corpsman froze for half a second. Everyone in the room knew what that meant, and everyone knew it violated standing medical orders. Rapid heat exposure was considered dangerous, potentially fatal. Official doctrine warned that sudden warming could cause cardiac arrest. The rule was clear: warm slowly, gently, cautiously. But slow meant death. The doctor had learned something different, not from manuals, not from lectures, from men who died while he followed the rules. The corpsman moved. A canvas curtain was pulled tight around the patient. Steam hoses used for cleaning equipment were redirected. Hot water bottles, normally forbidden in shock cases, were shoved beneath blankets. Another sailor cranked open a valve connected to the ship's heating system, flooding the small space with blistering heat. The temperature climbed rapidly. Too rapidly by regulation. Just in time by reality. A sweat broke out on the sailor's forehead within seconds. His chest hitched, his fingers twitched. "Watch the pulse," the doctor said calmly. The corpsman leaned in, fingers pressed to the sailor's neck. His eyes widened. "It's stronger." The sailor gasped. Not a weak breath. Not a fading breath. A full, desperate inhale. 30 seconds earlier, the man had been nearly gone. Now his chest rose again, rhythm returning, color creeping back into his face. Around the sickbay, men stared in stunned silence. The doctor exhaled slowly. They had just done something the Navy officially said should never be done. And it worked. Across the Pacific, in destroyers, cruisers, carriers, and transports, Navy doctors were facing the same nightmare again and again. Sailors pulled from cold water, gun crews exposed to freezing spray, men in shock after blast trauma, blood loss, and hypothermia combined into a lethal spiral. Standard treatment wasn't fast enough. Shock killed quietly. It stole heat first, then circulation, then consciousness, then life. Doctors followed procedure, and men died anyway. But a small number of Navy physicians, working far from medical schools, far from command scrutiny, began noticing a pattern. The men who survived were not the ones warmed gently. They were the ones exposed to sudden, overwhelming heat. Boiler rooms, engine compartments, steam-filled maintenance spaces, places no wounded man was supposed to go. But when they did, when they were rushed into those spaces for just moments, their pulses returned faster, their breathing stabilized, their eyes opened. It was dangerous. It was uncontrolled. It was completely undocumented. And it was saving lives. One doctor aboard a destroyer escort wrote in a private notebook, "Heat acts faster than morphine, faster than plasma, faster than prayer." He never put it in an official report. Another physician serving aboard a carrier noticed that deck crews revived faster when pulled into aircraft engine maintenance spaces rather than sickbay. The heat shocked their bodies back into circulation before collapse could set in. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't clean. It wasn't approved. But it worked in seconds. The problem was doctrine. Medical doctrine feared heat because of peacetime medicine, heat exhaustion, burns, cardiac overload. These were real risks in hospitals with stable patients. But combat casualties were not stable patients. They were dying. And dying men did not have time for gradual warming curves and textbook protocols. The Navy did not authorize this method. In fact, several doctors were warned, quietly, to stop using improvised thermal shock on patients. One officer was threatened with court-martial if he continued. He continued anyway, because he watched what happened when he didn't. One night after a destroyer plucked 3 sailors from oil-slicked water following a torpedo strike, the doctor followed regulation. Slow warming, blankets, IV fluids, oxygen. 2 of the 3 died within 10 minutes. The 3rd, pulled first into the engine room while chaos reigned, survived. That night the doctor stopped caring about regulations. From that point on, he made a decision. If a sailor was in shock and freezing, he would use heat immediately. Not minutes, not carefully. Immediately. Steam lines, boiler rooms, improvised heat tents made from canvas and pipes. 30 seconds, sometimes less. And men lived. Word spread the only way it could, through whispered conversations, off-the-record advice, and glances exchanged between medical officers who had seen the same impossible recoveries. "This isn't in the book," one would say quietly. "I know," another would reply, "but it works." The trick was timing. Too early, and the patient wasn't cold enough for the shock to matter. Too late, and the heart wouldn't respond. But in that narrow window, seconds before collapse, the sudden heat forced blood vessels to dilate, jump-started circulation, and shocked the nervous system into reasserting control. It wasn't healing. It was revival. By late 1944, a strange phenomenon began appearing in casualty reports, not officially but between the lines. Sailors who should have died were listed as recovered rapidly. Hypothermia cases resolved in minutes instead of hours. Shock fatalities dropped sharply on certain ships with no obvious explanation. Those ships all had one thing in common: doctors who ignored the rule. In one carrier group, survival rates for cold water rescues nearly doubled within weeks. No new equipment, No new drugs, no change in training. Just heat. Rapid, intense, forbidden heat. One senior medical officer finally demanded answers. He interviewed corpsmen, reviewed logs, and noticed discrepancies between official procedures and actual outcomes. When confronted, one doctor finally spoke. "We stopped waiting," he said. "We stopped being gentle. We brought them back before shock could finish them." The officer stared at him for a long time. Then he closed the notebook. "This never leaves this room," he said. Officially, the Navy never approved the technique during the war. There were no memos, no manuals, no training films. But unofficially, it spread across the fleet. And in battle after battle, storm after storm, rescue after rescue, men who should have been dead were sitting up within half a minute, breathing, conscious, alive. Not because of medicine, but because of heat. The trick worked so fast it terrified some corpsmen the first time they saw it. One described the moment vividly. It was like watching a man come back from the dead, because the ship itself reached out and grabbed him. By the end of the war, thousands of sailors owed their lives to a treatment the Navy pretended did not exist. And after the war, when peacetime medicine returned and doctrine was rewritten, the trick quietly disappeared again, too dangerous, too uncontrolled, too difficult to justify outside combat. But the doctors who used it never forgot. They had seen what heat could do in 30 seconds. And they knew that sometimes survival doesn't come from following the rules. It comes from breaking them at exactly the right moment. Cold killed faster than steel. Long before shrapnel, long before blood loss, long before panic, cold quietly shut bodies down. On destroyers, submarines, and landing craft across the Pacific and Atlantic, sailors pulled from freezing water often looked alive, but they were already dying. Their hearts slowed, their muscles locked, their blood thickened, their brains faded into silence. For years, naval medicine believed one thing above all others: move slowly, warm gradually, never shock the body. Doctors were warned that heat could kill hypothermia victims, that sudden warmth could trigger cardiac arrest, that rapid rewarming was dangerous, reckless, forbidden. And so men died while doctors followed the rules. Then one Navy doctor broke them. The moment that changed everything came aboard a battered destroyer escort limping back toward port after a night convoy action. The ship had stopped twice to recover sailors from the water, men whose ships had been split open by torpedoes, whose bodies had floated in near-freezing seas for hours. They were hauled aboard stiff, blue-lipped, barely breathing. One sailor had no detectable pulse. Another was gasping once every 10 seconds. The medical officer on duty followed protocol: blankets, dry clothes, slow warming, gentle handling. Nothing worked. Minutes passed, then more. One of the sailors stopped breathing entirely. That was when the doctor made a decision he was never trained to make. He ordered heat, not gradual warmth, not careful exposure. Direct, concentrated heat. He had seen it once before, months earlier, unofficially whispered about between medics. A trick used quietly, never written down, never approved. A method that violated everything medical doctrine taught. The doctor grabbed hot metal plates normally used to warm IV fluids. He wrapped them in towels. He placed them directly against the sailor's chest, back, and groin, where large blood vessels ran close to the surface. The crew froze. This wasn't allowed. Someone shouted a warning. But the doctor didn't stop. Within seconds, something incredible happened. The sailor inhaled. A sharp, sudden gasp, violent, uncontrolled, alive. Then another. Then his chest began to rise on its own. 30 seconds after being clinically dead, the sailor was breathing. The deck fell silent. The doctor didn't celebrate, he didn't smile. He immediately ordered the same treatment on the next man. And the next. Every single one responded. Men who had been drifting toward death snapped back into consciousness, coughing, groaning, vomiting seawater, but alive. That night, the destroyer escort saved more men than any medical protocol ever had. And the doctor wrote nothing down, because officially this trick did not exist. Across the Navy, similar stories began appearing, quietly, unofficially, passed from medic to medic like contraband knowledge. A heat lamp moved closer than allowed. A steam pipe pressed against a wrapped torso. A heated bulkhead used instead of blankets. Always the same result. Rapid revival. Heartbeat restored. Breathing resumed. The secret wasn't just heat. It was where the heat was applied. Doctors realized hypothermia didn't kill evenly. The body shut down from the inside out. The brain and heart failed because cold blood stopped moving. Warming hands and feet did nothing. It wasted precious time. But warming the core fast changed everything. Blood vessels reopened. Circulation restarted. The brain woke up. The body didn't go into shock. It rebooted. This went against everything taught in textbooks. But war didn't care about textbooks. By 1944, some Navy doctors were quietly training corpsmen to use the forbidden heat method immediately after recovery from water. No reports, no manuals, just word of mouth. They learned to recognize the signs. Rigid muscles, shallow or absent breathing, weak or undetectable pulse. And then they acted fast. Heat to the chest, heat to the back, heat to the groin. 30 seconds, sometimes less. Sailors who should have been dead were sitting up, shivering violently, crying, laughing, asking for cigarettes. Commanders noticed. Ships using these doctors lost fewer men after rescues. Submarines reported higher survival rates. Landing craft crews began recovering men who previously would have been written off as lost to exposure. Still, officially, nothing changed. Because admitting the trick worked meant admitting doctrine was wrong. And doctrine in wartime moved slowly. The breakthrough came after a disaster. A troop transport struck a mine in rough seas. Dozens of men were pulled from the water. Medics followed standard warming procedures. Half died within the hour. Another ship nearby, using the forbidden heat method, lost only 3. The difference was undeniable. A Navy medical review quietly opened. Doctors were questioned, not officially, not publicly, but carefully. The same pattern emerged again and again. Rapid core rewarming saved lives. Slow warming killed them. By the final year of the war, the Navy rewrote its hypothermia response procedures, but without acknowledging where the knowledge came from. Manuals changed language, timelines shortened, heating priorities shifted. The forbidden trick became standard practice. And thousands of sailors lived who never should have. Years later, one of the doctors who first used it was asked why he broke the rules. He answered simply, "I wasn't reviving bodies, I was restarting engines." That was the truth. The human body, stripped by cold, wasn't fragile, it was stalled. And heat, applied the right way, brought it roaring back to life. By war's end, Navy medical survival rates from cold exposure had doubled. Not because of better ships, not because of better rescue equipment, but because one doctor ignored the rules when seconds mattered. The men who lived never knew why they survived. They only knew they woke up. And sometimes that's all history leaves behind.